Okay, so it's super duper early on a Saturday morning, and we're getting ready to do massive reconstructive surgery on Quasi Ti. What you saw in the opening shot was a 4-bolt front end from a car that was wrecked 30-something years ago. Anyway, but the crossmember is in perfectly good shape. So we're going to take that crossmember, strip all the stuff off of it, and we're going to install it onto the Ti. This is a big job. This is most certainly not a job I recommend that you do at home. And you know me, I'm all about you doing anything and everything you can in your own garage. But this is probably one of those ones you don't want to do. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't know how it works. Now, this is the service bulletin technical sheets. This is for 750, 101, 102 series, 105 series, and 106 series. Very thick book. And it's all the technical service bulletins that came out from Alfa Romeo to the dealerships. Anyway, in September of '68, a bulletin came out that was announcing that there may be stress cracks related to the cross members on the early 2-bolt front end cars. Now, any early 105 series car is a 2-bolt front end. What that simply means is a lower control arm, instead of having 4 bolts that hold that control arm in place to the cross member, it has 2. Now, this wasn't simply just a cross-member issue. This changed a couple more times by the time the 2-liter cars came out. And I'll show you what that's all about. Now we're going to go back over this cross-member so you can get an understanding of what was the real problem. Okay, so this is a 4-bolt cross-member, meaning there's a bolt here, and on the other side there's 2 more bolts, a total of 4 bolts. Anyway, what had happened over the years was in the early cars, what we had was this area right here. This is what crosses over the cross member and goes back towards the firewall. In the early cars, the area around the cross member was just simply 20 gauge sheet metal with boxed in, yeah, I can't bend that open, with boxed in channeling on the inside to give it structural strength. It wasn't quite enough, especially when you consider that a lot of people would eventually put on bigger, fatter, grippier tires, and they would go track these things, or they'd do aggressive driving on the street. What inevitably would happen is you start getting stress cracks around the shock towers, and you would get stress cracks around the pocket that the crossmember sits in. So by the time the '69 model came around, at least here in the US, they started to double up this wall on each side. They doubled it up with, again, 20 gauge steel, with laminated another piece of 20 gauge steel. So the 1750 cars, that was okay, but it really wasn't quite enough, because by the time the 2-liter cars came out, you started to see this wall get thickened up, stamped out, if you will. Because now you had 18 gauge steel on the inside with 20 gauge on the outside and a different interstructural boxing system. And that made it far more stiffer. So essentially what had happened was through the years is the 2-bolt front ends were now changed out to 4-bolt front ends if the car was identified as having a problem. And all 2-liter cars, for that matter, technically the 1750 cars, also had 4-bolt front ends. All this is fine and well, but what it did identify was that we do have structural issues with the front ends of these cars. And it stands to reason. The more horsepower you put in this car, the more torque this car develops, the grippier tires, the tracking events, all this vertical metal on each side experiences a lot of lateral load. And what happens is the steering box puts a lot of stress on this. So you got a steering system that's trying to go left and a body that's trying to go right. That inner structure there just can't take it over time, so it fatigues the metal and you start to get all these crazy cracks all the way around the place. And it's generally not that safe. About 10 years ago, we had a car come in here and we literally took a hammer, and I had a video of it. We literally took a hammer, and about 4 blows of that hammer, the entire front end fell off. It's not something to just think it's humorous. Anyway, the other thing that we're doing with Quasi Ti is we're upgrading to a 69 pedal box. Why? Because it's hydraulic. I want to use a hydraulic clutch. Nice thing about 4-bolt front ends, they already have the implements for the hydraulic lines. So it's just another added bonus. That in conjunction with the 4-bolt lower A-arms, it's just an upgrade we need. Why am I really doing it though? Because the cross member in Quasi is bent. And whoever repaired it looks really kind of ugly. So here we are, front end's off, why not do it? Okay, so as you see, the welding up in here is really, really heavy. This cross member was not only bent up and pushed back. So we're cutting all this out. A lot of work. What you can't see is the shock tower is bent. Stretch cracks are all through here. And this is distorted. A lot of work. Okay, so you can see it's dark outside. Been at this all day. Cutting and being prepared to know what to cut on a process like this can be very, very difficult. This is not something that should be done in your driveway, because inevitably when I remove this, there's a lot of corrective work that has to happen. There's reinforcement plates that we need to put in, and then essentially we need to put the cross member in. And when we put the new cross member in, it takes a great deal of measurements and prep work before you can execute that. And that is something that needs to be relatively dead on when done, because it affects everything. It takes a little bit of experience and certainly a great deal of know-how to do this. But I thought for the most part you would enjoy seeing what it's like to do this in the first place. Really close, it's about to fall out. And that, my friends, is how you do that. Right about now you can see why this is not something you dare attempt in your driveway. It is a lot of work. I do mean a lot of work. However, in consideration, this is an inferior product compared to what's going in it. Again, we're going to a hydraulic clutch system, so it's going to be nice to have the configuration to hold the clutch line down, although that's a trivial thing. I do like the idea of having the 4-bolt front end, that way we can use the stronger wishbones and things of that sort. But this thing had to come out anyway. If this was straight, I wouldn't even bother. I would just work around what I have. But because this one's dented, and I mean bent bad, it had to go. Ergo, it's out. Yeah, you saw that right. At some point in time, this cross member was driven back, and somebody pulled it back into place, roughly. However, the gap that was created here was now filled in with a bunch of bolts, and they were welded over to fill in that gap. I have no regrets about pulling this thing out now. I only imagine what kind of stress points that was creating throughout the inner structure. Dodged a bullet. But what you may or may not notice is all the metal parts I'm putting in, the welded in flanges, they're painted gold. That is a weld-through primer. That is to ensure once we weld all this up, those parts don't rust, even though we welded them and burned away a minimal amount of the primer itself. Now the reason all the paint was removed from here is because we're going to put in heavy-duty race flanges in these areas where it's known to be somewhat weak. As usual, excuse the noise. It's a Saturday and everybody's working on personal projects. Anyhow, so as you see, the cross member is all welded up. It's in, we're done. But now it's on to the more difficult things. Now I have to put the hydraulic clutch pedal box in, which, as you know, is a 1 year only in the States anyway, a 1969 pedal box. And what provides us that option is this piece right here. It goes through the frame rail and it actuates a hydraulic master cylinder, which is underneath the seat. However, in the process of tearing this apart, I broke it. So it's fairly thick aluminum. So I vapor blasted it to remove all the contaminants, and now I have to go TIG weld it to put it back together. I do have 2 or 3 more of these, but because they're so incredibly rare and very hard to find, I am not going to part out another one. I'm going to fix what I have. The whole reason this happened was because I had to tear the pedals out because this thing needed to be redone. The pedals were stiff. The rods are known, if they get to binding, they are known for the end piece to rip out. So we want to avoid that. So it's time to service these. You should service yours even if you have just a normal 65, 66, 67 car. These pedal boxes should be taken out at some point in time in service because brass bushings that are in there, over time that grease that's in there becomes a little hard and very restrictive, and sometimes the pedal doesn't flow as free as it should. Anyhow, so I gotta go weld this up, and then we're gonna start preparing to make the cuts in the frame rail so it'll fit. Okay, so we welded up the pedal box, fixed that problem, and we made our exact measurements of where the drill bit needs to come through here for our pedal assembly. It's about to come through. Alright, so it went through, as you can see. So anyway, so the clutch pedal rod needs to come through here and back that way, and the clutch master sits back here a bit. And if this measurement is off, that pedal gets bound up in there, you're going to break it. Granted, doing 69 conversions is not easy. Now it's time to upsize and sleeve it. Okay, so we have to sleeve this over still. So we're not going to just leave that hole there. It has to have a wall in there to preserve it so we don't get any rust action in there later. But if you did your homework and you mapped it out right, bolt holes line up beautifully, and And there you go. Now, the arm drops down here and feeds the rod that goes back that way to the hydraulic, so that worked out pretty good. So now we've got to put a steel sleeve in there to protect that area. Alright, so right about now you're getting a sense of how much work it takes to do this. Not only did we upgrade the crossmember for a better later series crossmember, but we're also upgrading to hydraulic clutch, which again is not an easy process, and quite frankly, if you don't have the parts to do it, don't dream about it. It takes a lot of luck to find one. Anyway, so now we're going to weld the sleeve. Alright, so it's another one of those mighty quiet weekend mornings where you're allowed to work on your own stuff around here. It's too early morning for everybody else to be here, so that's a good thing. So, old Quasi here. I know I didn't film a whole lot of the process of changing out the crossmember for a couple reasons. One, it's not something you should do in the driveway. Two, the measurement system that you would need to use to make sure the thing is dead on when you install it can be a little bit complicated, and quite frankly, it's not available to the regular public. So it's kind of a moot point. Another reason why I didn't want to put it out there and show you the exact way of doing it was, quite frankly, some folks will take a little bit of information and try to implement that into a situation for themselves, and it could be potentially dangerous. The last thing in the world I want to do is have any influence on somebody changing out something so scary, so dangerous as that crossmember. Anyway, but the other thing is though the car had been badly smacked in the front end, and now it is very squared up and better than most, it's actually within factory tolerance. It's actually better than factory tolerance because it's exact. The suspension on the car was relatively new, but because the chassis was twisted and because there's so much unnecessary stress put on that front suspension, bushings and things of that nature all were wearing out quite quickly. So these are the lower A-arm bushings, okay? And some of them are in pretty good shape. They're still dead center. They're not stretched in any capacity. However, some of them, I know that it's hard for you to see, these were all changed at the same point in time when this front end was redone by somebody, are completely blown out. And that's a little bit of a shame, because if the chassis was somewhat square to the front end, that probably wouldn't need to change. But we changed everything out. I changed out the end links, changed out the lower ball joints, I changed out the upper arm casters, and obviously everything you see here was changed out. But we're moving on to the next subject that we had to deal with, and that is how to get that ideal 1-to-1 ratio of throttle and fuel delivery from the Spica. Now there's a couple of systems out there that this has been attempted on, and quite honestly, it's a little Rube Goldberg looking. There's too much articulation, there's too much adjustment, there's too many points of interest on it. And what I mean by that is if you have more than one point reaching any one connection, you complicate the ratios. And I prefer to dumb it down. What we end up doing on the car, and I'll show you that in a minute, we end up using an awful lot of parts from a Spica fuel-injected car. So we use the throttle pedal assembly, which comes across the firewall, which is different than carbureted. The carbureted link rod that goes over to the cross from the firewall over to the carburetors, it points down on carbureted cars because it's pushing a rod to open up the throttle bodies on the carburetor. However, on Spica cars, there's a cam that rolls over the top and you're pulling it back, which means that the throttle arm comes back instead of pushing. Okay? These are things you got to think about. So anyhow, we decided to use a lot of the original parts for a Spica car to make all this work. So that gave us an opportunity to make some simple changes in design, and quite honestly, really cheap. So I'm going to show you what that's all about. So this is all set up like it's going to be. Now, granted, this motor's not built yet. Crank isn't in, the pistons aren't in, nothing's done. But I did need to mock it up for the motor mount. Why was that critical? Because this motor mount on this side, the intake side, is going to be a part of the bracket system that holds the throttle assembly to pull the fuel delivery linkage down. I'll show you what it's all about right now. Okay, so as you just saw, this is a aftermarket throttle cable assembly. Really, really cheap. Don't cost much. This thing right here was less than $20. But this is an original Spica throttle assembly. Here's the rod that comes across, comes up to here instead of pointing down like on carbureted cars. So when you step on the gas pedal, it pulls the arm back, which pulls this down. Now you can see how I'm actuating that fuel injector pump. That's pretty cool. Very simple process, and it's a 1-to-1 ratio, which is the most important part of this entire thing, is making sure we have a 1-to-1 ratio. What do I mean by that? Well, quite simply, if the pedal moves an inch, the cable needs to move an inch, which means that the pump needs to move an inch, which means the throttle assemblies need to move an inch. If you start articulating with so many different kind of rod links to make all that happen, it becomes very difficult to have a simple 1-to-1 ratio. So essentially this is sorted out. This is kind of done. Cross member is fully welded in. It's upgraded. All brand new steering link systems. Now it's time to tear all the stuff out, tighten up this engine bay, and get it painted. Okay, so I wanted to use a carbureted style intake manifold simply because I didn't want all of the fuel injection molded into the intake manifold stuff that I wasn't going to use, just sitting there looking blank and unused. So anyway, so I decided to go with a carbureted style intake manifold for a 2-liter. Reason I wanted that one for a 2-liter is because this right here. This is the assurance that water's always going to be flowing whether the thermostat sticks or not. Okay, this is the bypass that drops down to the front of the water pump. Anyhow, so in the process of doing all this, this is called the thermostatic actuator. This is for the fuel injected cars. Basically, as the car warms up, this sits inside the water flow area. As the car warms up, this pin right here starts to extend out and it pushes down on a plunger that sits right here on the Spica fuel injection. And what it does is adjusts the fuel delivery to the overall system. Okay, so with that said, now you wouldn't have to use this if you had some trick race setup or if you were using what they call the Schenkel adapter, which is basically a cable that pushes a plunger out. But I just wanted this to be more alpha and less aftermarket. Okay, so essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to have it threaded behind here, okay, into the manifold. So I'm doing some critical measurements to mount that into the water flow right in front of the thermostat. So as the thermostat is sitting there not open yet, the water's starting to get transference of heat from the coolant inside the block. This will get hot, this will extend, the fuel delivery will get out. Okay, so, but the intake manifold on a Spica car is a bit wider than on the early car. So what do? I'll show you. Not that hard. Okay. So the overall distance of this is our challenge. So what I did is I went and took some Delrin, cut it down. Delrin's easy to work with. The nice thing about it is it seals tight. And I made an adapter so it'll fit in my manifold. Just that simple. Okay, so the overall process of doing this is not that complicated, much as you just simply need to think through what it is you're trying to do. So that's my solve for the distance on that manifold. This is probably the last of the things you need to think through to try to make all the system work, because it's not complicated, it's not a very hard job to do. However, you do need to have some knowledge of how the individual components work. Carburation versus fuel injection, the fuel flow versus carburetor and fuel injection, the return line you need to be able to incorporate because fuel injection doesn't consume all the line fuel that's sitting in it. So there's little things you need to think about, but nothing that is complicated or catastrophic to work through so far, and I don't foresee anything else being in our way. Okay, so this is my thermostat actuator. It's now installed into a non-Spica manifold, and we had to use a Delaware base to compensate for the lack of thickness in this. But as you can see, it wasn't that big a deal. It's not that hard a job. Again, the reason I'm only approaching this way is because this is something people have asked about a lot over the years, and this is the first time of us tackling this, and I don't see why this can't be something you can do. Because as you already know, especially if you've watched any of our videos, fuel injection outpaces carburetors all day long. So this is a win-win scenario. We have a sexy looking throttle body that looks like carburetors, and yet it is fuel injected. And when you hear this motor run, you hear the response, and you understand that you don't have to worry about altitude changes, you don't have to worry about complicated pain in the butt starting and all that stuff. This is always going to be the way to go if you can.